So we talked about biological contaminants. So let's talk a little bit about chemical contaminants. Residual chemicals from growing food like pesticides, fertilizers, insecticides, and herbicides, all of these things are considered contaminants. That's why we rinse our vegetables and our produce before we cook with them. Food service chemicals like we're using in the dish department sinks or in the sanitizer, those can be detrimental. That's why we have to test them for how many parts per million against the water to make sure that at a proper dilution rate to prevent transferring those chemicals into food. Toxic metals or toxic metal poisoning can happen in several ways, two of them being mercury that's in the water that gets ingested into the fish, and then the fish holds that within their body. When I was younger, growing up at Lake Erie in Ohio, the fish were deemed to have too high of a mercury content, so you were at risk if you caught the fish and then cooked it and ate it. So for, I think it was about 4 or 5 years, they highly suggested you did not fish and or do a catch and release, so you did not actually keep the fish and plan to eat it. Cooking acidic foods in an aluminum pot can also cause toxic metal poisoning, where the metal releases toxins into the food that you don't see, you don't smell typically, and you typically don't taste, but can cause problems. You've all heard about lead paint poisoning and lead in pencils many years ago. We've all learned from that, but the point is that those things can be ingested or absorbed into a person, and that can affect life. So physical contamination, the last of our three: biological, chemical, and now physical. Physical is the identification of foreign objects in food. Again, if you remember our slide earlier, it can be present in the food or naturally occurring in the environment, and it could be a completely foreign object that has no reason being there. For instance, like metal shavings from a piece of kitchen equipment. So if you open a can of tomatoes and that can opener does some damage to the lid and kind of shaves little scrapings off into there, or you true the edge of your knife and you don't wipe it off, you're transferring metal or a foreign physical item to that food. A piece of broken glass from a container, hair is a physical contamination, rocks, stones, bones, all of these things. So we have to be very careful and pay attention to that. And back to cross-contamination. I think that you are getting the point of this. The food service worker, and what do they cause? Cross-contamination. Again, cross-contamination is when food is contaminated by another via a worker, food, or even a piece of equipment. Dirty cutting boards, dirty knife, dirty side towels, dirty apron, dirty hands, dirty equipment. So you have to remember to clean as you go. You don't just leave a mess till the end of the day. You actually clean as you go, and then you completely clean up before you change or start a new task or at the end of a task. And remember, as part of proper safety and sanitation, you first clean, so that's going to be with wash, and that's removing visible debris or product. And then you sanitize to reduce microorganisms to a safe level. So throughout this discussion or this lesson, we've talked about identifying foods, we've identified bacteria, we've named some, we've understood or applied the knowledge of how bacteria growth or how to control them. Well, an additional practice is to look at the food that you're bringing in, like we've talked about with reputable suppliers. But even with that, they can still provide food to you that has a short shelf life, for instance. And then food can become spoiled, which not only costs you money, it can also cause you to not have product available that you need so you can serve your customers. So we are looking at right now what's called FIFO, and LIFO. FIFO stands for first in, first out. So the product you receive first is the first item you use and you send out the door. LIFO is a term that is not as frequently used, however it's very prevalent in our industry. So LIFO stands for last in, first out. Well, chef, why would you buy something and use that first instead of the old stuff you have? That's a great question. When you work in this industry for 25 years like I have, and Chef Rounds has done it for 28, you will find a broadliner like a PFG or a Cisco buys bulk food and then they ship it to you. Well, when they over order and they can see that the shelf life of the products they have are between 7 and 10 days, they will sell it to a produce company or another company, but produce often, because that's why produce does produce and dairy, for instance. LIFO and FIFO typically apply, or LIFO typically applies to dairy. So they'll buy it, and so this time you don't buy a broadliner order because you only needed some produce and you knew you could get dairy from them. So you buy your sour cream from them because you were just going to be a little bit short. So you get a new container, 5-pound or a case of 4 5-pounders, however, and you look at the date and it says September 30th. So you take it out of the box, you're going to store it in your refrigerator, and then you pick up the one container you had and it says expiration date October 15th. How can that be? It's the example that I've just given you. So would you put the October 15th in front of the September 30th? Or would you make sure the September 30th is used first, giving you as much time as possible to use that product so it doesn't go bad? We all know the answer. So that's LIFO and FIFO. And we're looking at product dates, delivery dates, and use by dates. This slide is addressing the clean, sanitize, and sterilize, or sterile, as I was talking about earlier. But again, clean, removal of visible dirt, sanitize, reducing pathogenic organisms, those that cause foodborne illness, to safe levels, and to sterilize is to destroy all living microorganisms. Again, you do not see that in a kitchen. All right, continuing on into our discussion of keeping food safe and sanitary. That also goes along with our workers, which we've mentioned, buying from reputable suppliers. That also includes the facilities in which we operate. So pest management is a huge, huge, huge concern in our industry. We have flying bugs that can be present that can cross-contaminate by flying from raw chicken to salad or to lettuce, and we just don't see it. It could do it from the kitchen and then go out to somebody's plate, and you have to minimize that. So the first step is to build pests out of your facility. That means when you have a facility, if you're designing it, you keep pests in mind and how to minimize the risk, how to keep rodents out, how to detect if rodents are present, how to minimize bugs or flying insects, cockroaches, and so forth. Next, you want to create an environment in which they cannot find food, water, or shelter. If you think about it, those are the 3 things that humans need: food, water, and shelter. If you have an area like the dish area where you're always having trash, food from pans and plates being scraped, you need to make sure you keep a clean area. So you need to have a dishwasher or a staff that cleans top to bottom daily to minimize the opportunity for bugs to get there. I mean, think of ants, and I can't tell you how many times I've seen ants in my life be able to sniff out food on the middle of a pavement. Who knows where they were when they started, but they're now completely covering a piece of food that somebody dropped. Insects, bugs, rodents, and things, or pests in general, will find a way if you create the opportunity. They like water. A lot of times these pests like damp, cool, dark places, especially where they can't be seen. You know, one of the things we talk about is if you see one cockroach, there's probably thousands that you cannot see. One item that I know a lot of businesses tend to ignore. Why? It costs money, or it costs lots of money. And sometimes when you're just trying to survive and keep your doors open, you take shortcuts. One shortcut you should not take is to allow an opportunity to try to control pests yourself, because you will fail. There are specific ways to handle pests, to get them out, to keep them out, and to keep your food safe and to keep your place open. So you need to rely on professionals, people that have been certified and know how to handle product to minimize time to minimize wasted time, to minimize cost, even though they may cost $500 for their visit. It's going to be much cheaper than somebody getting sick, you losing food, the health inspector seeing it and closing you down, and then having to get re-inspected to reopen, and all of these things. When you look at pests, they're anything that do not belong. It doesn't have to fly, it doesn't have to crawl, it's just anything that doesn't belong. That's not a microorganism that's causing foodborne illness. So that can include insects, rodents, rats, mice, moles. Moles are a newer topic because they can get into gardens that chefs are growing and then pulling food from. Flies, fruit flies, a new one since I've been at Reynolds is drain flies. They kind of hang around the floor drains and live down in there, and they lay their eggs. They are extremely hard to get rid of. So prevention, make sure they can't get into the building. If you find a hole, patch it, close it up. Seams like in the floor, if there's tears in the carpet where things can hide under, floor tiles, drains. You want to eliminate shelter, food, and water as mentioned, so don't have any water that stands in drains. Don't leave food on the ground. Make sure you clean your soda machines that have a lot of sugar regularly. You also want to make sure that you have the right type of walls and coverings on the walls, coving on the floor that protects the floor to the wall. Clean up spills immediately. You want to keep your food at least 6 inches off the floor, and that's not a request, that's actually a health code. And quite honestly, I don't see how somebody could put glassware or silverware 6 inches above the floor and then somebody slops some mop around. So really you got to be very selective on what goes on that lowest shelf at 6 inches. And the idea is that at 6 inches you should be able to clean under that shelf adequately. If you have the ability, 10 inches is probably a much better approach to the bottom shelf, to get a broom under there, to properly get a mop, and also to see. You don't want to push all your racks up against the wall and push boxes up there because things can hide behind it. If you know anything about cockroaches like to lay their eggs in cardboard boxes. That's why in a food service establishment, when your order comes in, you take everything out of a cardboard box and get that cardboard box out of there. The only time sometimes that's ignored is if you were putting it into the refrigerator where the eggs, if the cockroaches were there or the eggs are present, they don't have the right environment for them to hatch until you bring it into a warmer temperature. And again, use professional exterminators. All right, we're moving on into our last few slides here. So we want to talk about a safe worker. So we talk about personal safety, and that's going to be monitored and regulations set forth by OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Act. They are an operation that does inspect things. You don't often see them in your business until there's an issue, but they do issue regulations and guidelines that you must follow and employ. Fire safety. You need to know what type of fire extinguishers you need to have in the kitchen. You don't want to use a Class A versus a Class K if it's not going to help do the job effectively. You want to train your staff on them. You want to know how to use them. You want to have them in the proper locations that they're supposed to be so they're readily accessible to minimize damage that maybe a business can't recover from. First aid. You need to have first aid available. Band-aids, burn cream, all of these different things. You need to have it accessible. You can't just lock it up because if somebody needs it in a hurry, they need to have access to it. Do you have your staff trained, CPR trained, how to administer the Heimlich maneuver? Do you allow them to do that? Are they required to? Do they have to sign a waiver? All of these things become not important, but they are more pressing when you are in charge, because you have to make sure your team is ready to go to be safe as possible and to protect your customers that come into your establishment. So continuing on with our safe workers and OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, they mandate safety in a workplace. To maintain a safe kitchen, you're to clean spills up immediately. In fact, if you have a spill, you are not supposed to walk away from it or an accident. You're supposed to get somebody else to go get the stuff you need to clean it up or to block off that area, or to get somebody to stand there with it while you go and get those things. You need to operate equipment properly. I've seen this time and time again that something breaks or isn't completely workable, and somebody will figure out how to jerry-rig it so that it'll still work, but that makes it highly, highly unsafe. Operating equipment properly also includes those that have not been trained to use equipment attempting to use it. There's laws in place that says anybody under the age of 16 can't use electrical equipment. And even in some states or counties, they can't do it until they're 18. Wearing a proper uniform that fits properly without jewelry. Too loose of clothes can be a trip hazard. It can catch on moving equipment as somebody's walking by. Same thing with like chains hanging from belt loops into pockets and wallets. Jewelry falling out, getting caught or lodged into something. When you're using knives and equipment, make sure it's for the intended purpose only. Don't use a knife to pry open a canned good. There's a can opener for that. Don't try to slice deli meats on a mandolin. You don't horseplay. You don't run in a kitchen. You walk. You keep sure footing. You wear kitchen safety shoes. You clean up spills so there's not a slip hazard. Even slip-resistant shoes will slip if there's enough stuff on the ground, oil or water, or if somebody's rushing, or if somebody gets bumped while they're moving. You need to keep exits, stairs, aisles clear. One thing that doesn't come up frequently enough is that you have a responsibility to your customer while they're on your property. Your property includes the drive up, the parking lot, the sidewalk walking in, the doors, the foyer, the dining room, the bathrooms, the hallways. If you have a chef's kitchen or a station or a table for the guests to sit at, now you got to worry about the kitchen safety for your customer. Because remember, we don't want to just think about our workers, because we need to balance all of the components within our grasp. So you need to worry about your customers. So if you see a trip hazard out on your sidewalk, you need to get that marked off immediately. I remember when I was 15 years old at my first restaurant, and I became a manager when I was 16, 17 years old. We had to do manager walks every 2 hours. So I had to go outside, walk around the building, inspect the parking lot, come back in, inspect the building itself, and then the other manager would have to do it as well. But it was very eye-opening. One of the instances that came up was in the winter with snow and ice. If you're not going to clean off your sidewalk, you might as well just close for the day. Because if somebody slips and falls, the chances that they could sue you and could win are much higher than one would think. Same thing if you serve alcohol and you don't teach your bartenders to observe actions and cut them off and offer a ride home. If they were to get in an accident, they could sue and you could lose. And when I say offer a ride home, doesn't mean you have to ask your bartender to let them go in their car and drive them home, but offer to call a cab or call a friend for somebody so that they don't actively drive themselves. And in America today, it's going to continue to get more pressing that we need to be more observant, need to be more cautious, have better standards, practices, and policies in place, and train your employees to have some empowerment that they can make those decisions, or to get a manager so that they know how to handle the situation and keep you and your business safe. Continuing on as a safe worker, we need to assume that pots and pans are hot and handle them with dry towels. Remember dry towels. If you have a damp or wet towel on something hot, what happens to water? It heats up and eventually it turns to steam, and then you can get a steam burn. We don't want anybody to be injured. We don't want to cause them to not look the same as they were when they came in. So we've got to be careful. So make sure your towels are dry. Have oven mitts. Have two. Too many people go to the oven and just have one towel, and then they still try to get the product out of there. That is very unsafe. You don't necessarily remember or know how hard or heavy that product is, or how hard it is to get it out of the oven if it's a full sheet pan that hits the sides as you pull it out, if it's got a lid on there, or if it's got foil, or did somebody push it in too far. Pull the rack out some. Don't try to stick your arm in there and balance it from not hitting the two racks. You will burn yourself. Position pot and pan handles out of the aisle. So if you're standing at the stove and somebody's walking by, don't have the handle sticking straight out. You also don't want to turn it and put it straight over a flame, because a lot of people forget that they need to have a towel when they're handling pots and pans on the stove. Get help with heavy objects. Nobody needs to be a superhero or He-Man or She-Ra. Be safe. Be careful. Protect yourself. Don't injure yourself. The thing I always joke about, but I hope that people take serious, is you don't get paid enough at any job to injure yourself that you can't live your normal life any longer. Don't hurt your back. Don't hurt your feet. Don't overbend or extend or anything like that. Get two people with trash. Don't overfill the trash cans, for instance. Put heavy objects at waist level or below so the shelf is safe, so that you can use your legs to lift it. You're going to try to balance it with your upper body. Use stools or ladders to climb. Don't climb on the shelf. Don't step on a bucket. Don't lean. Don't stand on your tippy toes. All of these things cause deaths every year. They cause injuries probably every day somewhere across the country. Keep breakables away from food storage or production areas. You don't want to have a glass bottle that can drop and fall into food, or like the ice. And I see this happen all the time. Servers at a restaurant take a glass and dip it into the ice container to fill it with ice. What happens if that glass breaks? And you have a server that's so afraid that they did it that they don't tell anybody. So then you go get your ice properly, by the way, use your scoop, but there's glass in there. And now it's going to look like you're at risk and in trouble in the business, and this person gets injured. It's unfortunate, but it's true. Warn people when you're behind them. I call this kitchen talk or kitchen speak. You need to communicate. You communicate with your partners. You communicate with your managers. You communicate with customers. You communicate with your instructors in class. Behind, oven, hot, knife, corner, slippery, accident. And you don't have to speak, oh, I just wanted to let everybody know that I dropped something over here. You don't have to be that. But you got to be loud enough. And I say that because time and time again I have a student every semester, or even multiple ones, that don't know how to enunciate because they want to talk like this, and then when you're in the kitchen with the hoods running and pans and stoves going. Fortunately, you're watching this on a computer or listening to it on your phone. You hopefully still heard me. But imagine that in a kitchen and somebody's trying to tell you, fire. So you got to get your kitchen voice. You speak loud, you speak clear, you speak confident, so that people can hear you. And I always joke, but I've been in kitchens for 25 years. My hearing is not what it used to be. Not only am I older, but it's 25 years of kitchens. You've got to speak up so that everybody in the kitchen is safe. When you're carrying hot pan behind you, don't back up. I could talk about this all day because students don't understand it. The other part of this is acknowledgement. If your chef says, or instructor even, says, did you hear me? Did you cut this? Or whatever. They expect an acknowledgement. And they don't do it just so they can hold you accountable that you heard what they said and said, didn't you hear this? Didn't you say you did? But it's more importantly, they're trying to make sure that you understand what they've said so you can act and complete the task. Whether it's, did you take notes? What's the answer to 4 plus 4? Did you get that tip for the recipe for the day? Did you hear your timeline? We tell you these things so you can be successful and prepared. Into our last 4 slides, and I know I mentioned that a couple slides before, probably 10-15 minutes ago. But now we want to cover or catch up on this HACCP topic, or this active managerial control that I mentioned earlier in this lesson. So HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis critical control points. And what it is an effective and hopefully an efficient system for managing and maintaining sanitary conditions in food service operations. So what does HACCP mean? Oh, it means hazard. No. What hazard or HACCP means is it's a plan that's been reviewed, designed, and put in place, trained your employees, and then you make sure you monitor and make changes as necessary and keep paperwork on file of the business and operation pertaining to safety, sanitation, and food. So in another slide, we'll look at the steps to this. But active managerial control is another version of this, meaning HACCP is one, active managerial control is another. So some places may not do a HACCP, they may do active managerial control. Same idea, same process, same components, they just call it different things. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So on this slide, we have the HACCP system or the flow chart. As you can see, there are several steps involved. First step is to identify potential hazards. That's your hazard analysis. You want to evaluate their severity and the risks that are attached to them, and that's all you're doing at this step. In the next step, you're going to identify critical control points. So your first two steps, we are laying out HACCP, hazard analysis, critical control points. That should help you memorize the first two steps. And those steps are to identify where hazards can be reduced or eliminated. You can also say it as, where do hazards exist, and then I need to implement reduction or elimination processes in it to keep things safe and or sanitary. The next step is to establish procedures for controlling these hazards and correcting the problems. And that's an extension of step 2. We've identified them. Now we need to figure out what we're going to do to fix them and make them safer or more sanitary, which is still a form of safe. Next, we want to monitor the critical control points and correct problems as they arise. So what's happened is we've identified, we figured out what we could do, and then we implemented it. Now we're watching to make sure that the critical control points are being controlled. And if there's action or problems, we need to take corrective actions to fix it. And that's the biggest part of this, I would say, that people often forget. The second one is the last step, but I'll cover that in a moment. Just because you have a plan in place does not mean it works, or does not mean it doesn't need adjusted from time to time. So if you see an issue, because you're monitoring, you may see or find that you need to make changes, whether it's a new employee that isn't clear, or they need to be trained because they didn't get trained, or you've changed products that you use. And now the chicken used to become par cooked and now it's frozen. And so now you got to slack it in the refrigerator till it's thawed, and then you got to cook it, and all of these different things. You need to set up and use a record keeping system. That is the most important thing outside of anything else to protect yourself. And that will be what a health inspector comes to look for, especially if there's ever been a foodborne illness claim or outbreak. So lastly, we verify that the system is working and adjust it as needed. Well, what's the difference from step 4, Chef, when we look at monitoring it? Well, at that point, we're still verifying that our solutions and resolutions that we suggested or planned out are working. And the last one, we're making sure that all those previous steps are working. We're making sure that we have a process for tracking, logging, storing the paperwork and how long we have to store it. We make sure we have the training in place. We make sure that we're updating this if we change our menu or our menu ingredients. And that's being active, and that's being a manager, and that's being a controlling agent. Hence why active managerial control is a variation of HACCP with its own guidelines. Whereas in class we may actually cover this in more detail, But this particular slide is a recipe showing critical control points, CCPs. If you saw a CP, that would be a control point, an area that I could control it, but it's not critical in the sense that I can now make people sick. And finally, in our last slide for Chapter 3, I just wanted to take a moment to discuss and cover labels. At Reynolds or in your kitchen classes, we don't often have food that we store and save, but this is a critical thing that you will be exposed to in the industry, and it's a necessary entity because you don't just want to throw everything away just because you didn't use it. In fact, I don't know any place that would do that. It's irresponsible. But I don't know any place that could do that and still keep their doors open for as long as they want to, in the sense of, I had to close because I ran out of money. And that's because I threw food away because I didn't save it or plan accordingly or so forth. So on the slide, there's a version of a label here. This, for instance, has a Friday label on it. Not all of them have it. This is just one sample. You always need to label the item. When labeling, you have to label anything that has been changed from its original item that you can no longer readily identify. For instance, you get carrots in and you take them out of a bag because that's what you do. You don't need to label them as carrots. Anybody that sees it, they know it's a carrot. It's not cut up, it's not peeled, it's not chopped up, mashed, pureed, whatever it may be. But if I took that and shredded it and turned it into carrot salad, but it's just shredded carrots at the moment because I haven't added the mayonnaise and raisins, whatever it may be, I still need to label that now as shredded carrots, because once you cut it, you have a shelf life, and that's less than 7 days, or at max 7 days. So anything that is not in its raw form that's clear, then it needs to be labeled. When you get a case of something in, maybe you get frozen breaded chicken tenders because you don't make them by yourself, which is fine. If they remain in the case, the label is on the case. And people don't think about it that way, it's just taken for granted. But when you remove it from that or alter it, you have to now fix it. The shelf life, everything that you have has a 7-day or less shelf life. Dairy is a little different, cheese is a little bit different, but they typically even print shelf life on it. Bags of chips have a shelf life. And that is 7 days from the minute that you finish that product. So if you cook a piece of chicken right now, you have 7 days. That's it. So you also have to add if it's AM or PM, because AM could be 8 AM, PM could be 4 PM. And that's an additional 8 hours that you have to be concerned with. You write the date, you sign your initials or your name so they know which employee did it, so if there was a question it can be verified. You put a use by date on there. Sometimes people you will use just little day dot stickers that have a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday on it. So everything gets rotated based on that color sticker. And they do that because you shouldn't have 2 blue Monday stickers unless they were all from the same day. And if you have 2 from the week, the Monday before and then the next Monday, the Monday before is now probably bad, and we have poor product rotation. And I know this, I learned this back 25 years ago at my first restaurant at a steakhouse where we had to rotate the meat pool so that the meats were thawed when we cooked them. The temp line on this particular one is so that people are monitoring the temperature. Why is there 3 spaces? I repeat it all the time? All 3 times? No. You take the temperature of when you stored it, you take the temperature an hour or 2 later, depending on your policy for the business, to see what temperatures it is at now. And if it's not where it needs to be, you may need to take corrective action to get it there before 4 hours so you don't have to throw the food away. Third line, up, it's at 38 degrees. It's now safe as long as the refrigerator doesn't go down. So labeling is an important part. Some places may not actually use a label, and that's why we often have you carry a Sharpie pen, a marker. People will write on saran wrap. The one thing to remember is if you are using labels, or when you use labels, if you cooked chicken yesterday that you plan to turn into chicken salad today, and then you're going to label the chicken salad because it's not chicken any longer itself, it's a chicken salad, what date do you put on there or use by? The initial thought for people is, well, 7 days. And that's not true. Because the chicken was cooked yesterday, it started its 7-day trek or countdown yesterday. And now you use that same chicken into turning it into something else, so that chicken salad now has 6 days or less. If you have something thawed and then you freeze it and then you re-thaw it, you pick up where you left off. So it was thawed for 3 days, and then you freeze it and you pull it back out, and once it thaws, you only have 4 days more that product is going to still be servable or okay to use. The good thing is if you cook it within that time, you start over the shelf life for 7 days. So technically you can get a max of 14 days. 7 days raw, 7 days cooked. If you have something cooked like a soup and you reheat it, you can start over the 7 days again. A couple of years ago, the health code changed where you can heat and reheat and cool and reheat food as many times as you want, as long as you have a good process in place that is proven to be safe and followed. Meaning it heats up to the proper temperature for the right amount of time, it's hot held at the right temperature, and then when it's cooled through the TDZ zone in the proper amount of time and held at that temperature until it's reheated again. Lastly, just for labels, the health code does have some flexibility in labeling for up to 24 hours. So if you're working with something that you're going to use the same day or within 24 hours, you don't necessarily have to label it. And I would caution you to consider, how do you prove that it was made within the last 24 hours or that it's going to get used in the next 24 hours? And I say that because why would you want to argue with a health inspector when they're the one assessing and grading and scoring you for being safe and sanitary? So I would encourage you to label everything. If they find even one item that's outside of 24 hours that they can prove that's not labeled, it can be an immediate critical violation, even though it's one item out of the hundreds and hundreds you may have. So remember, labeling is extremely important. If you are taking a product that has a label and you're changing out the pan, just because you change the pan doesn't change the date. You may put a new label on it, but it should have the identical information as the previous label.